Willkommen zum Draht zum Rat. It's my great pleasure as the head of the office here in New York of the Friedrich Ebert Stiftung to welcome you all to a new series of conversations on peace and security in the Security Council during the tenure of Germany at the Security Council in the coming 2 years, or actually in 2019 and 2020. With this new format, this new audiovisual format, we would like to invite you to a conversation on what's happening in the Security Council, the developments and the debate in the Security Council. It's an offer to engage in a very intimate and informal way with UN experts here in New York to understand what is actually being discussed in New York and what are the options and possibilities for Germany being a non-permanent member of the Security Council. I'm very pleased to be here together with Richard Gowan. Richard Gowan is a very well-known expert, and we're very happy to have him here with us. I just would like to introduce you very briefly, and you are a senior fellow, I think, in 3 different institutions, in the Center for Policy Research at the United Nations University, also at the Center for International Cooperation at NYU, and also a senior fellow at the European Council on Foreign Relations. You have been teaching and you taught at Columbia University as well as at Stanford in New York, at Columbia University at the School of International and Public Affairs. And you've been publishing and broadcasting widely at BBC and CNN, at Politico, at Le Monde, and The Economist and The Washington Post, and many more. You also have a weekly column on the diplomatic fallout for World Politics Review. And you are a widely quoted commentator and also a very astute analyst and acute observer of issues related to peace and security, particularly conflict prevention, the UN system as such, but also the European Union, European security, and I would say also international cooperation and international governance and the multilateral system as such. You have published for the Friedrich Ebert Stiftung last year in May a policy brief dealing with the challenges for Germany in the Security Council well ahead of the election and the actual assuming of the seat, which is called In the Hot Seat: What Can Germany Achieve in the Security Council? I would just briefly say a few words about the Friedrich Ebert Stiftung. The Friedrich Ebert Stiftung is an analysis, education and dialogue based institution which works on progressive policies, both nationally in Germany as well as internationally. And here in New York, the Friedrich Ebert Stiftung has focused on international cooperation in multilateral settings with a developmental perspective, bringing in particularly also the voices of the emerging and developing countries. And if you would like to know more about our work, please visit our website, fesni.org. The publication in the Hot Seat has met with a lot of interest and was widely discussed, also within the German Ministry of Foreign Affairs. And Richard, in the paper you had set out an ambitious agenda for Germany serving for 2 years at the Security Council, and at the same time you had made it very clear that the Council is in very bad shape, and the world power politics right now render global crisis management more and more difficult. So we are very eager now to learn and to see and to hear from you how things have changed, and where do you see sort of the greatest challenges, and what you would how you would phrase your recommendations for Germany under the current situation, now sort of 1 month into the session of the Security Council, in which Germany will be a non-permanent member. Please.
Well, thank you very much. It's a great pleasure to be here. I mean, it is very early, obviously, to make any big judgments about how Germany is doing in the Security Council. I would say that the early reviews of Germany's diplomatic performance here are positive. There is a sense that the team led by Christoph Heusgen, Ambassador Heusgen, are professional and they are well prepared. And Heusgen and his advisors, I think, did a good job in the closing months of 2018 of getting up to speed on the major issues facing them. And that matters because everyone wants Germany to be a brilliant member of the Security Council, but before you can be brilliant, you have to be competent. Security Council diplomacy is a fast-moving technical business, and the permanent members of the Council, such as the French and the British, often suspect that elected members are not quite ready for the rough and tumble of New York diplomacy. And it's necessary for each elected member to prove that they really can play at the top level, just in terms of day-to-day good diplomatic practice. Germany's predecessors as Western European members of the Council, Sweden and the Netherlands, both were seen as very competent. The Swedes in particular had a real mastery of the Security Council procedure, different ways to function here. People were asking, would Germany have the same level of competence? And I think the initial feeling is yes. This is a good team. It's well prepared, and it knows what it's doing here. So that's important. Now, has that translated into any big diplomatic breakthroughs for Germany in New York yet? No, but that isn't Germany's fault. I mean, it's actually in some ways been quite a quiet start to the year here at the UN, in part, in Security Council terms, because the first country to hold the rotating presidency of the Council was the Dominican Republic. And the Dominican Republic decided that it wasn't going to organize a huge number of thematic meetings or big strategic meetings. It had a fairly light agenda for its month in charge of the Security Council. It did hold a meeting on climate change, which Foreign Minister Maas attended. It held a meeting on women, peace and security that he also attended. Those went well. It's no criticism of the Dominican approach to say that it was light, but it meant that there weren't that many big thematic debates for Germany to contribute to. Similarly, this month, Equatorial Guinea is in the chair. They just held a meeting, I think, on mercenaries in Africa, but it's another fairly light month. So there haven't been that many opportunities for Germany to make big foreign policy statements in the Security Council to date. There have been crises. There have been two major crises that have dominated the Security Council agenda. The first was over the disputed results of the elections in the Democratic Republic of Congo, and the second has been over the situation in Venezuela. Now, again, these are not necessarily topics on which Berlin was ever likely to spend a huge amount of political capital at the UN. On the Congo, it had been clear for a very long time that a crisis was coming, and the question of how to deal with the apparent rigging of the Congolese elections split the Permanent Five. South Africa is also in the Council. South Africa has a strong voice on these issues. And I think there was always a sense that the Council's response to the situation in Congo would be driven by negotiations between the US, the French, the Chinese, and the South Africans. Overall, the mood in the Security Council was that the most important issue was stability. As a result, it does look like the Congolese elections were won by unfair means, and the Security Council is not really going to dispute them. Now, in a series of debates, Germany asked good, tough questions about the process. But that was not an issue on which I think Germany could make a big impact if the US and France did not want to really sort of create a fuss. Similarly, Venezuela is clearly going to be a massive topic in the Council this year. We've had one very tense meeting on Venezuela about 2 weeks ago, in which it's very clear that you have a split, a pretty fierce split between the US wanting to see a change of regime in Caracas, and on the other hand, China and Russia very much supportive of the current Maduro government. Germany has raised concerns about the situation, but that is a extremely difficult situation. The European Union is still only just working towards a clear position over what to do, and so I think that Ambassador Heusgen and others are going to spend a lot of time on Venezuela over the coming months. But there hasn't been a moment for Germany to really stake out a sort of a decisive position on it yet. So for all these reasons, Germany has yet to have its big moment in the Security Council. But we can actually see that the big moment is coming. And in a sense, January and February are a warm-up months for the German mission, because in March and April we will have first France and then Germany presiding over the Security Council, replacing Equatorial Guinea. And this is very interesting because Paris and Berlin have now confirmed that they're going to run this as a joint presidency. They're going to run the back-to-back presidencies as a unit. That's never been done before. It's not actually a contravention of Security Council rules, so it's an interesting innovation. No one has objected to it, not even the Chinese or Russians who might have. And this is a big opportunity for Paris and Berlin to sort of show that they have a common position in Security Council affairs, which is something that was promised in the Élysée Treaty last month. They're going to be talking about issues like international humanitarian law and trying to restore some consensus around international humanitarian law, which has been severely shaken over questions like Syria. And I think it's incredibly important that you have France and Germany working together in this way, because at the end of March we will also have Brexit. And we may have Brexit. Who knows whether we will have Brexit? But in theory, we will have Brexit. And this is, Brexit has an impact on the UN, because to date, it's been Britain and France who have been the dominant EU members in UN affairs, most obviously in the Security Council because of their vetoes. Perhaps, possibly, the UK will leave in March. It's almost certain to leave the EU at some point this year. And so the big question is, can France now work with Germany as a partnership as a partner in leadership in the United Nations? And this Joint Security Council session, Joint Security Council presidencies, is a really important opportunity for Paris and Berlin to show that they're serious about working together at the UN. So in sum, a difficult start to the year over Congo and Venezuela. Germany has not had a breakthrough moment in the Security Council yet, but that's not its fault. That's just the nature of the situations on the agenda. But all eyes are now turning towards March, April, and France and Germany's joint presidency of the Security Council, which could be a really exciting moment in terms of multilateralism.
Thank you very much. Thank you for sort of describing the scene very precisely right now, and pointing out the sort of current developments with which the Security Council needs to deal, and Germany plays a particular role. Germany sort of is described as an sort of by many as an honest broker who has sort of established channels both with Russia and China, but also with the US. So in some way, sort of the expectations are still sort of high with regard to many of the crises with which the Security Council will have to deal in the future. I think Germany has made it very clear that the overall topics will be both sort of prevention and human rights mainstreaming in a way, as it was called, to make sure that that is sort of the overall theme. But it also has pointed out that they will work on climate change, they will work on women's role in peace and security operations, but also protection both of women and girls in women and girls in sexual harassment in conflict situations, and also humanitarian work as such, and the protection of humanitarian workers, and strengthening also the legal basis for humanitarian work. If you look at the sort of a bit more at the long-term perspective, where would you see Germany can come in with sort of some credible clout also, and take a leadership role in addressing issues with which the Security Council has to deal? I just also want to say we would love to hear from you, and also would then invite the audience to bring in questions, and because that's the idea of this format, that we would like you to sort of raise your questions and get them discussed here in this interactive format.
Yeah, I mean, firstly, on the thematic issues, Berlin is interested in a very wide range of thematic issues, and as I say, one of the topics that we expect to be very high on its agenda in this joint council presidency with France is precisely international humanitarian law and the protection of humanitarian workers. And Germany naturally has a very strong voice on these questions, both because of its commitment to international law, but also more practically because it is a very major funder of humanitarian action, and so it has a clear stake in ensuring that humanitarian operations can succeed and are secure. We also we expect a very clear line from Berlin on climate change and security. As I say, Foreign Minister Maas was already here discussing that last month. That's interesting. 10 years ago, even at the start of this decade, when Germany was last in the Security Council, there was a lot of opposition from China and Russia to the mere idea of discussing climate change in the Council. The Russians are still skeptical of it, and obviously the US is a little skeptical of it these days. But China, in particular, has started to shift its position and is much more open to talking about climate change as a security threat. So there, I think, there's quite a lot of political space for Germany to fill. The problem is, the Security Council cannot compensate for the difficulties of the implementation of the Paris Agreement. So, it can focus on questions like the effects of climate change on the Sahel, where we see desertification, but it's not actually the perfect body to deal with climate change. Just on this question of Germany as a broker, I mean, in my paper for you last May, in the hot seat, I very much emphasized this idea, which I've also emphasized in reports for the European Council on Foreign Relations, that Germany may be able to act as a bridge with Russia in UN affairs, just as Germany has acted as a bridge with Russia over Ukraine in the European context. And that's especially important because Britain and France have extremely tense relations, and the US has extremely tense relations with the Russians here in New York at the moment. I think that if if Germany is going to be in a position to strike, or at least facilitate big power deals in the Security Council, the most obvious places to do that are over Syria, where over the next 2 years the Security Council is going to have to work out what its attitude is to President Assad after his victory. And Germany has signaled that it wants to play a leading role on that question in the Council, and it's managing discussions of humanitarian affairs in Syria. And the other issue is Ukraine. If there's any chance of a peace agreement for Donbass, it's still quite likely to involve some sort of UN peacekeeping force. That's something the coalition agreement last year advocated. And no one really knows if there's going to be an opening for peace in Ukraine. It certainly isn't sort of a probability, but it is still a possibility. If there is an opening for peace in Ukraine, I would expect Germany to be a central player in the Security Council on that. But there's been no movement on that this year, and that there won't be movement at least until after the upcoming Ukrainian presidential elections. On Venezuela, as I say, that's an issue which is clearly causing really serious tensions now between Russia and the US. But on Venezuela, it's less clear that is a situation where Germany has the leverage to play a major brokering role. Although clearly the European Union as a whole desperately wants to ensure that there isn't a breakdown in Venezuela, and there is still a serious, credible risk of civil war there that everyone wants to avoid.
Mm-hmm. There's another issue where Germany has sort of announced that they would take a particular focus on, which is disarmament and arms control. And we have now the current crisis with the INF treaty being suspended by the US and by Russia. But we also have those big topics of how to move forward with the so-called Iran deal, but also with North Korea. So maybe you would share with us some of your thoughts with regard to sort of this particular focus on disarmament and arms control, but also the more, even broader and more varying questions of INF, North Korea and Iran.
Well, the INF, the sort of collapse of the INF treaty, I think represents a very serious challenge to the coherence of the permanent members of the Security Council. And in fact, diplomats from the P5 were all in Beijing last week for an annual discussion of nuclear affairs, and it was an extremely tense occasion, precisely because of the splits over the INF. Although Russia actually raised the INF treaty in the General Assembly at the end of last year, this isn't really an issue that can be worked out through the Security Council or even through the UN. The basis for that sort of major nuclear arms control agreement remains talks between Moscow, Washington, and perhaps Beijing. But if there is no progress in those areas, it certainly will have a very damaging effect, I think, on diplomacy in New York. I mean, if the P5 can't agree on baseline nuclear security issues, that's going to make their diplomacy over many other issues harder. On DPRK, I think I'm right in saying that Germany is chairing the North Korean Sanctions Committee connected to the Security Council. That is a very, very sensitive task, not least because UN sanctions experts have in the past tabled real evidence of Russia in particular breaking the sanctions regime. But it's a technical role, it's a managerial role. The main diplomatic track remains the Washington-Pyongyang diplomatic track. And so to some extent, the UN as a whole is waiting to see what happens in the next leaders level talks over North Korea. I think that there is maybe a 50-50 chance that if the current US outreach to North Korea does fall apart, and I think there's a very good chance that it will fall apart in the next 2 years, then you'd have a new dynamic in New York, because you'd have the US coming back to the Security Council demanding more sanctions on North Korea, demanding more punishment for North Korea, and I'm not sure that the Chinese and Russians would support that this time, in contrast to 2017 when the Chinese worked quite closely with the Americans on it. And so Germany could at that point find itself coming back to this idea of Germany as a bridge with Moscow, trying to work out some sort of common ground on how to deal with North Korea. Interestingly, one European diplomat, not a German diplomat, recently told me that they saw the E3, France, Germany, and the UK, trying to develop a more coherent position on North Korea to increase Europe's capacity to influence that diplomacy. On Iran, it's a double challenge. On the one hand, we see the E3 working to keep the Iranian nuclear deal alive. On the other hand, there is growing European discontent with Tehran's behavior, both over missile development, but also over assassination attempts on Iranian dissidents in Europe. I think that Germany will, I think, try and stay as close as possible to both the French and the British in defending the nuclear deal here from American attacks, but I think keeping up as much pressure as possible on the Iranians to show them that they can't get away with bad behavior on other matters.
All right. While we wait for people to come in with questions, maybe we can touch upon the big question which always comes up when we talk about the Security Council, which is reform and sort of the interest and the need to make it more inclusive and more representative. And Germany, sort of in the past, I think both Angela Merkel and Heiko Maas have strongly sort of spoken about the German seat being also a European voice, or sort of making sure that Germany speaks in also in a way for the European Union, and so that is sort of one question or one perspective on sort of making it more inclusive. On the other hand, sort of we have this big question. I mean, is there ever going to be a reform? And if we think about reform, does it always mean expanding the participation or the representation, or are there other types of reforms thinkable which are more feasible or more likely to happen in Germany, having a role in sort of pushing forward in that?
I mean, the first thing I would say is that while there obviously is a theoretical case for Security Council reform, there are some fundamental political obstacles, especially to enlarging the permanent membership of the Council. And, obviously there are countries such as Italy which specifically oppose Germany getting a permanent seat, but that isn't the real source of tension here. The real source of tension is in Asia. Germany works with Japan and India as well as Brazil in campaigning for permanent seats on the Council, as I guess everyone knows. China has made it abundantly clear that it will not accept any reform leading to a Japanese permanent seat. And that is, the Chinese have been very, very tough in opposing even extremely limited advances in discussions of Security Council reform. So unless Germany were to deliberately break away from Japan, and probably also India, in its search for a permanent seat, then I see no chance of progress in the near future. Similarly, there were, I think, people in Paris and Berlin who would have liked to have an ambitious statement in the Élysée Treaty, Élysée Treaty 2.0, the Aachen Treaty, for an EU seat in the Security Council. I think the French professional diplomats worried that would weaken their position, and also pointed out that there's no precedent for a regional organisation, even an extremely tightly knit regional organisation like the EU having a seat. So I don't frankly see the smallest glimmer of a glint of hope that we will make any progress on Security Council reform in the next 2 years. And if I were Ambassador Huysgen and his advisors, I would say, well, let's take the world as it is, not as we would want it to be. Let's show that Germany, coming back to my opening remarks, really is a competent player that can play at the highest level in the Security Council. Let's see if we can get some deals with the Russians on Syria or perhaps even Ukraine. Because in the long term, it's actually that sort of pragmatic, effective diplomacy which strengthens the case for Germany to have the Security Council seat. Because again, otherwise you will find even French diplomats saying, well, the Germans are trying very hard in UN affairs, but they're not quite at the level to qualify them for a permanent seat on the Security Council. So, the best way to work on this is through practical actions. Right.
Thank you very much. Maybe we can turn to, again, one of the topics we had touched upon earlier, this focus on women, peace and security in the coming 2 years. What would it actually mean if the Security Council moves ahead? I mean, we have the 1325 resolution, and I mean, you hear a lot of support everywhere. Whenever you touch this topic, people say, yes, it's very important to have women on board, to have them, to include them in the analysis, to sort of have them also to have women's leadership also in peace building and conflict resolution. But what would it actually mean? I mean, what could the Security Council actually sort of achieve with Germany leading on that particular topic?
I mean, I think in UN terms, the Security Council can play two main functions, and one of those is quite organizational, but it is important, which is to support the Secretary General, Antonio Guterres, who has made achieving gender parity and promoting gender parity in senior appointments in the UN. The Security Council can really back him up and give him political momentum. And we've seen some progress on that. We have seen Guterres achieve gender parity in terms of his most senior appointments of the top level staff in the UN. The head of the Department of Political Affairs, Rosemarie DiCarlo, is the first woman to hold that post, for example. So she's overseeing a lot of the UN's mediation work and its dealings with places like Iraq. At a broader level, looking beyond the institution, looking beyond appointments, I think that the reality is that the Security Council, which is a crisis-driven, reactive body, often doesn't pause to think about gender affairs, gender security, when it's looking at specific crises. When you're having a thematic debate about women, peace and security, everyone is very positive. But when you're actually talking about Mali or the Central African Republic, this issue gets sidelined. Now, Sweden, Germany's predecessor on the Security Council, really tried to shake that up last year, and it organized a debate on Afghanistan, bringing in, asking everyone to have female participants, folks speaking, talking about gender dimensions of the Afghan conflict. I think everyone except possibly the Russians adhered to that, and you had a very different sort of debate that really put women and girls at the center of discussions of Afghanistan. I think I'd hope to see Germany do that on more issues. I think that would be very positive, especially because Germany is also handling the Afghan file. There's space for more practical actions. For example, the Security Council is still only at quite an early stage of thinking how it uses tools like sanctions to deter sexual and gender-based violence. I think that's something which the German mission is interested in. So it's a range of actions from the largely symbolic through to more practical. There's no one silver bullet to make the Security Council take all gender-based issues totally seriously. There are members of the P5 that are frankly not completely committed to the program, whatever they may say. But Germany can continue to push just as the Swedes pushed.
All right. I think we've covered a broad range of topics which are currently at stake and are being debated at the Security Council. And I think I would actually like to thank you, Richard, for giving us this sort of introduction in our first conversation in this series called Der Draht zum Rat, which translates to the wire to the Council. And I think true to your sort of own how do you say your description of how you look at things? It's a 50-50 mix between pessimism and optimism to describe the current multilateral scene and the conflicts and crises which the Security Council is looking at right now. And we take this as a first introduction, and would like to thank you wholeheartedly for joining us and coming over today. And I would like to thank everybody on the screens and in the audience. See you next time. We will inform you about the next Draht zum Rat, which will take place in the course of the year at different points of time. And thank you very much. All the best here from New York.